Let me tell you about Arch, where I get all my clothes and honestly what I am wearing right now on this podcast. They nail that perfect balance between style and comfort without breaking the bank. From the first time I was in the shop, the experience with Arch has been incredible. The personalized recommendations, attention to detail, and delivery really set them apart, whether on the golf course, hitting the gym, or heading into the office. Arch has me covered with polished, elevated pieces that keep me feeling confident, comfortable, and stylish all day long. They make sure every aspect of your wardrobe is taken care of, blending versatility with a premium feel, all while keeping things accessible. If you're looking for a brand that delivers on an exceptional experience from start to finish, is where you'll find it. Welcome to the Journey Podcast, a show dedicated to health, wealth, and happiness. Join us on the journey while we explore the world your health and wealth make possible. Michael, welcome back.
Adam, pleasure to be here.
Great. Good to see you. For anybody that's seen or have seen the show before, you'll notice that the background is a little bit different this time. We're trying a few things on our end, which really has been reflected in the hiatus or the time it has been since we have done this. But we are back. Based upon that, I thought it would be good to kind of look back to the first conversation you and I had, and really you being the first when we launched this. But one thing I want to talk about, I think really why you're here today, is one, your expertise, and two, the topic itself, financial planning, or really more about the evolution of planning in this space within wealth management, kind of where it was, but more importantly, where it's going. And I think we talked a little bit about this on the first episode where we touched on kind of just wellness, wealth, the integration of all those components. But what I wanted to talk to you today is really specifically about what Journey Wealth is doing within the wealth space and the planning space and how you've reframed that perspective. So I'm going to start with a question, which I think will really set up the broader conversation.
Fire away. Sounds great.
Perfect. What do you think about when we talk about the term of purpose-based planning?
Yeah. So purpose-based planning really comes down to aligning your financials with your life aspirations, right? There's this propensity in the industry to focus the conversation around dollars and cents, balance sheets, cash flows, and all of these things. And what we're trying to do by taking more of a purpose-based approach is to really understand what are the motivating factors that are driving people to make some of the financial decisions that they do, right? So the ability to align your goals, both personally and for your family, with your financial and career goals to create a comprehensive plan that takes into consideration what you want to do today while making sure that you're taken care of 10, 20, 30 years from
I think that's great. Well, I think that sets up the broader conversation just like we wanted to start. But I would like to ask, I think what you're sharing is kind of the evolution of where it is. How would you take that definition and apply that to kind of where the industry has been really the last maybe 5 or 10 years?
Yeah. So, when I think about it, I've been doing financial planning in some sense now for almost 15 years. And it's sort of what I said before. It's very, is the balance sheet in line? Is the is the cash flow sort of lining up with what your expectations are? And will that math allow you to accomplish some financial goal out into the future? Broadly speaking, that's retirement, right? But what it doesn't do is it doesn't factor in what are you going to do in retirement? How are you going to fill your time? How are you going to make sure that you're feeling fulfilled? And oh, by the way, when you go from a place of accumulation to a place of decumulation, that's a major flip that I think financial planning historically hasn't really accounted for. We've just told people, save a bunch of money. If you do that, you'll be fine. But we haven't talked about, from a mindset standpoint, that shift from, okay, I'm a net accumulator to now I've got this pot of money. I need to start supporting my lifestyle when I no longer have cash flow coming in. That's a major shift. And so what we want to do along the way from a financial planning standpoint is make sure that we're understanding what's important to the client and we're helping them prepare for those shifts as they come along.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's a bunch of words you use that I would, I think about, right? Accumulation versus deaccumulation, I think is a wonderful point, right? Like a lot of the planning work in the past was really about like, how do I get to this destination? Whatever that is, or however you define it. I think getting people to wrap their head around the idea of what do I do when I get there? Um, you know, my parents are probably so sick of me using them as examples over the years from my career at Vanguard to now. And I used to use them a lot, right? Because they were like that the specific example of what you just shared. It's like, hey, they've reached that space. They're 72, 73. They did all the things that they were supposed to do. And it's what do you do now? Right. And I think now more than ever, that's the hardest question to answer because your insights that you shared, like a lot of what we're talking about, cash flow, balance sheet, income statement, these are all math problems to a certain extent, and math is very 0 and 1. But when we start talking about purpose or what that plan is, right? Talk about lack of 0 and 1, and there's so many elements to it. How
Yeah,
have you go ahead?
Adam, I apologize for
Nope.
jumping in. I think what's really important is to understand financial services as an industry over the years, right? So if we go 20 years ago, candidly, people were calling themselves financial advisors, but all they were really doing is acting as a broker, right? It was a transaction-based business. The advice was largely driven by compensation and not necessarily outcome, if you will. There has been a transition over the last 10, 15 years to being more focused on the planning side of the business. And so you're starting to hear more advisors say, oh, we're a comprehensive wealth management shop. We do financial planning, investment management, this, that, and the other. And now what we're starting to see is, look, investments in many ways are table stakes, right? We have to do that well. Our clients expect us to do that well, but it's not necessarily the primary thing that they're looking for us to deliver for them. We need to help them sort of piece together all of the things that are going to allow them to be successful while making sure that that definition of successful is created by them rather than prescribed by us. And I think that's where we're starting to have some success is sort of incorporating some of that fact finding, not on a quantitative side, but on a qualitative side to really understand what's important so that we can factor that into some of the quantitative side, recommendations that we're making for clients.
I think that's spot on. I think if you think about the evolution of many things in this world, right, it started at point A and you continue on that destination and it moves in the general right direction, right? And I think what you're talking about is, went from very transactional orientation to a certain element of kind of fee-based planning. And I think now we're at that precipice or that inflection point of like, what is the next wave? And it's really about, I think what you have coined here at Journey, or what we have coined here at Journey, is that purpose-based planning element. You mentioned some of the things you're doing to do that. Could you touch on kind of some of those examples?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting thing when you tell people that you want to have conversations around wellness and you work at a wealth management firm. That can be a tough bridge for people to cross. And so what I've really focused on doing is incorporating elements of, you know, purpose-based planning into the data gathering process through, very specific questions that allow clients to go as deep as they want without pushing them to the point where we sort of hit a standstill because there's a question they're not comfortable answering. Uh, Historically, you might ask a question like, tell me what retirement looks like to you. It's a very broad question. Years and years out into the future, they don't necessarily know what that means. And look, the reality is our average client is, somewhere between 50 and 55 years old. They're not necessarily staring down the barrel of retirement. And so they're still very much focused on what am I going to do tomorrow, next year, next 5 years. And so I'll try to reframe the question by saying, what do you want your life to look like in 5, 10 years? Or, what do you want it to look like 12 months from now? And get them talking about that. If I start to see them going down the path of strictly numbers, right? Just opening the question up a little bit further and say, great, understand that making sure the financials work, but how do you make sure that you're taking care of yourself and your family so that when you get to this, you know, point that we call retirement, you're able to do the things that are important to you at that time as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, what I hear is you're just reframing the perspective for a lot of people, meaning you're reframing what perhaps wealth means to them. You're reframing what, financial success means to them. You're reframing what, their legacy means to them. It's all things that they have probably thought about in some form or fashion, but now it's much more about kind of how does it integrate into that financial wellness pillar. So what does life look like? You know, I'm sure you're tapping into like, hey, what's important in terms of what we pass on and who we are. How has that been received in terms of client conversation?
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag, right? I think there are times where clients aren't necessarily prepared to go into some of that, and that's okay, right? What we understand is clients are coming to us with a certain level of expectation. We want to deliver on that expectation, but to the extent we can take the relationship a little bit deeper and understand the motivating factors, I think it leads to a more trust-based relationship. I think it opens up the conversation to be more productive in time. So, I would say broadly speaking, people are open to the idea when it's positioned the right way. And a lot of that is we got to get the reps. We got to ask the right questions. We got to get the right feedback. And, part of our job as advisors is to be able to read the people that are sitting across from us and say, like, is this a value add? And, if it's not, we need to pivot and make sure that we're delivering on what the client is, coming to us to deliver on.
Yeah, I think that is very thoughtful, right? Because you're not going to do the square peg round hole, right? For some people, it may not, they may not be ready, right? Like that's a big thing. I see that a lot in the coaching space,
And
where
it's a risk with planning, right? So there's this tendency for us to be very prescriptive where we say like, oh, you have to do it this way. But the reality is, and I say this often, if someone comes to you and asks you what time it is, you don't want to tell them how to make a watch, right? And so if they're not ready, that's okay. Part of our job is to understand, where are they on a continuum, right? We've got this idea of what a perfect client might look like. The reality is nobody's a perfect client. I wouldn't be a perfect client, but is there the opportunity to take the relationship to that next level, make sure that we're understanding things and placing them in context rather than just walking down the same path with everybody that comes through the door?
yeah, I think that's it, right? And what I mean is, I think what you're sharing is the idea of purpose-based planning at Journey is, of course, you're starting at the financial foundations or the fundamentals, right? If people come for financial planning, absolutely, that's going to be the key piece. But I think what you're trying to integrate in is like, how do we continue to move them up the pyramid of, hey, from financial foundations to, of course, coming to you is right to achieve a level of financial freedom, to achieve a level of the big milestones, to get to that key piece, which I know gets talked about a lot, is like, hey, this sense of peace of mind. And then I think where purpose-based planning really starts to kind of hit home is that next level up of, creating a life of kind of flourishing for people, right? Like, hey, we're hitting on all the key things. It's helping people across those four pillars we talk about of financial, spiritual, physical, and mental in some form and fashion. And it may not be kind of the breadth and depths in some specific area, but by and large, you're planting those seeds to kind of achieve those components. So, as the head of kind of like the planning side of it, where do you think like we are in terms of the industry, and then where does Journey fit within that space?
Yeah. So, integrating wellness through the four pillars is something we're starting to see. Four pillars is something that we've incorporated, but this idea of holistic wellness is something we're starting to see trickle into the industry. I think we're attacking it head on and saying, look, the reality is a lot of people can do investments well, and a lot of people know how to navigate financial planning software. How do we add value for our clients? Right. And I think a really important element is there can be this sense that when we talk about wellness, that clients need to talk about all their deepest, darkest secrets with their advisor. And that's not it. What we're looking to do is understand what's important to them. And to the extent there is a need to engage a physician, engage a mental health professional, engage a nutritionist, whatever it might be, have those conversations with those professionals. We're more than happy to make the introduction. Our job is to highlight the importance of those. And so, I think by cultivating the relationships with these professionals, like-minded folks who understand what we're trying to do and are delivering the same level of, world-class client service to their clients, creates sort of a one-stop shop effect where people know that, yeah, we can tackle taxes, we can tackle investments, we can tackle estate planning, all the various things, but we can layer on all of the things that we've talked about so far. And I think that's going to be a major differentiator for us on a go forward basis. We're starting to hear some really positive feedback as we get out into the community and make presentations to various groups. I know you've done a lot of work there, and the feedback has all been really positive. So we're going to keep going. No brake pedal for us on this one. We're full steam ahead.
Well, and I think, yeah, thanks for kind of recapping because I know we touched on that a little bit in the first conversation we have had, but I think it's important to bring it back. One, it's been a little bit, and two, for anyone else that's listening. And I think you shared specifically what's happening here at the firm. And I want to pull it back to kind of just the industry wide, right? Because there's been some interesting stuff coming out of some research done. But for example, I was reading a Fidelity study yesterday, and it said only 35% of Gen X, Y, and Z investors feel an advisor's primary value is delivering investment management, right? Of that breakdown, 17% of those people in that group said their primary role is to achieve overall life goals. 20% is a peace of mind, right? That thing we talked about a little bit earlier. 29% said financial planning, 35% said investment and or portfolio management, right? Like that is the next wave of wealth that is coming. We all know, right? The boomer generation is slowly but surely handing those assets down to family, and that wealth is growing across that spectrum. They've grown up in a very different area when you talk about both the X, Y, and Z. But I found that pretty shocking that 17% wanted them to help achieve overall life goals. How does that feel for you?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's shocking because you're like, I work at a wealth management firm. What do you mean the bulk of what I do is not centered around finance? But the reality is, and you touched on this, is specifically, millennials and beyond, there's been this shift to really focusing on mental health, on physical well-being, right? And work-life balance. And a lot of people can have a lot of differing opinions about how that has played out in the professional, workspace. But the reality is, our job is to adapt to what our clients are looking for. And so, I can understand it, right? When I think about what's important to me, both my wife and I have made transitions professionally that were largely driven by quality of life, right? And that's not working less or anything to that level. It's more about, do I work with the people I want to work with? Do I enjoy the job that I'm doing? Do I have the opportunity for improving professionally, but also personally? And we're seeing more and more of that from the younger client base. And if we're not, running out front ready to incorporate some of that into what we're doing from an advisory standpoint, the world's going to pass us by.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really thoughtful because I think it shows kind of just the evolution of, how people are starting to feel from in a small specific example. But, we've talked about the bigger picture a little bit. And I think what's really interesting is, when we talk about the pillars, right? Financial is a key one. It's really the key piece that you do at a wealth management firm, right? It's the first one, but I think what's really interesting is kind of how the rest of those actually impact that financial pillar, right? So what I mean by that is, you touched on, when you start to understand what is important to you, which is a key component of purpose-based planning, whether that is like, hey, the big one is what is your purpose, but more importantly, what do you enjoy? What do you want to do? What do you want life to look like? What activities are you participating in? All of those questions kind of then also do anchor back to that financial piece, right? Because they determine how much do you actually need, right? Like what I mean by that is like the big number, what's on the balance sheet, cash flow, what do you actually want to do? I think really what's really interesting is a specific one around the physical health space, um, meaning I'm sure you've worked with clients in the past over your experience of years, right? Like, hey, I want X dollars because these are the things I want to do when I retire, right? I want to play golf. I want to travel. I want to play with my grandkids. But all of those are impacted by your physical health, right? And what I mean by that is like, hey, can I actually play golf? Can I physically travel? Can I get up and off the ground with my grandkids? But I want to talk to the financials piece of that because there's another interesting study, and I'm going to go back to Fidelity again because I've been on their rabbit hole a little bit on their website. They do a study every year on that is like on healthcare costs, right? And it's basically based upon their most recent study as of actually 2023, the average couple needs for medical expenses in retirement $315,000, right? Like that's a really big dollar amount. And I want to tackle it first in more of a traditional way. And then I just want to bring it back to the purpose side, just to kind of show a little bit of example, some of the things you're doing. But specifically in a more traditional sense, how would you tackle that conversation?
Yeah, great question. So, there's two sides to what we do, and there's more than two sides, but there's the dollars and cents side, and then there's also the psychological side. So first and foremost, when you throw a number like 300 and something thousand, that's a big number that people have a hard time processing. And so what we do from a planning standpoint is we will set, this is your projected annual out of pocket expense from a retirement standpoint. And that is informed by that Fidelity study. We reevaluate that number every year and we attach an appropriate inflation number to that to make sure that we are, conservative in our assumptions. And I think there's a lot that goes into that, but there are planning tools that are available. There is a tendency or a shift towards more high deductible plans where folks have access to health savings accounts. And what we see a lot of is they fund the health savings account. And then because they have a high deductible, they're spending out of the health savings account currently, right? While we're fortunate to work with a lot of folks that have significant free cash flow. And so there are benefits to fully funding that HSA on an annual basis, but not touching it until retirement, right? And so funding your ongoing healthcare needs out of your cash flow while you're still working can pay significant dividends into the future. But it also, one of the things that we focus on is part of the reason that number is so high, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that number is based in the United States. Part of the reason that number is so high is because as a country, we haven't always done the best job of taking care of ourselves, right? And so we don't just want to think 30 years into the future or 20 years into the future, but how are you taking care of your mental health, your physical health today so that we can help to mitigate some of those higher costs out into the future? And so it's optionality, right? You can pull some of that spend forward to bring down the aggregate costs, or at least that would be the way that we would think about it in time, is if you can focus on the health now and doing the things to take care of your body now, you're going to be able to do those things for a lot longer and be much happier doing.
Yeah, I think, one, thanks for the details and the insight. Two, I think that last piece is kind of that transition, right? You kind of touched on like these are the fundamental things you can do from a wealth management perspective. I think that second piece is the interesting piece, and that's the intersection of kind of this idea of purpose-based planning where both health and wealth come together. My simple mind thinks about it in the sense of, hey, you can save more in some form or fashion and hope that works out. Or to your point, it's the other one is I can get healthier too, right? And I think that's the interesting piece is not only are you tackling kind of the financial wellness component of it, but now you're talking about the other pieces, right? Like, you know, the idea of that purpose-based planning of tying lists, and these are the numbers, this is the black and white, but then more importantly, these are kind of that purpose-based components, and how can we tackle those, right? Like, let's talk about it. What do you want to do? How do you want to experience that form of retirement? Meaning, like, how do you want to feel? Like, how do you want to show up? And what can you do now, right? Lift weights, exercise, work on your mobility, focus on nutrition, see your doctor on a more proactive approach. And I think that's what's unique is like marrying those two together.
Yeah, and look, there's not a you don't have to wait, right? So if playing golf is important to you, spending time with your grandkids is important to you, my first question when I hear that is, okay, what are you doing now? Right? How much time are you spending now? And are there opportunities to take some of that and pull it forward? Because look, the reality is your grandkids are way more focused on spending time with you when they're 5 to 10 years old than they are when they're 15 to 20 years old, right? So pushing that back 10 years has a significant impact on the relationship that you're going to be able to develop. And if you do it, you make it a priority today, you're going to continue to have that relationship where you might not see it fall off. Whereas if you wait until grandkids are 15, 20 years old, sure, they may engage, but it probably won't be the same because they have more going on and they haven't prioritized that over the last 10 years. They've prioritized other things. And so, we encourage people, if this is important to you, you're saying you value it now, let's lean in. And that doesn't have to slow you down, right? Part of our job is to figure out how do we do this? It's a yes and not or. There are tough decisions that you have to make. We know that, and that's part of what we will help people do. But if you're not even asking yourself the question, how can I start to factor some of this in to what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis right now, we're going to look back with a lot of regret.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. I think you teed it up perfectly, and I didn't tell you that ahead of time. But I think the other piece of that is what you're talking about is you're shifting that narrative or conversation, right? When again I think about wealth, we think about wealth management space or financial advisory, right? Like we think about money, we think about stocks, we think about investments, we think about market returns. But you're talking now on one of my favorite topics, and it's like reframing what currency means. And what I mean by that is, again, it's, I say currency, people say dollars, maybe Bitcoin now too, who knows, but I'm talking about time, right? And I think that is a very big one. I use this a lot on the coaching side because I'll say, it's amazing that we will so freely question like, hey, how much is that? Meaning, you know, this morning buying going to the local coffee shop and looking at a latte and it's like, you know, $8. And you're like, well, that's $2 more than I paid, 2 years ago. And that's outrageous, right? And it's $2, but we will freely give up our time for something that, maybe adds very little. We'll say yes to spending 2 or 3 hours doing something that maybe isn't beneficial in any way. But I think that's what you're talking about. So it's again, pulling that, asking or reframing that question, right? That maybe it was done in that traditional sense, but now you're just reframing it in a different way and making it resonate so much more for clients, right? And asking that question. Could you touch a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me started on coffee, right? You and I are both coffee fanatics, and if we started to get into the dollars and cents of what's a fair price for coffee, I think people would be shocked. But look, you need this is something, Adam, that you've kind of shifted my mindset on is you talk about, we talk about return on investment and you talk about a return on experience, right? You have the opportunity to experience those things. Something as simple as a simple cup of coffee, even if it is $8, simple cup of coffee with a good friend in conversation, you're going to walk away from that a heck of a lot happier than watching your portfolio go up. Sure, everybody wants their portfolio to go up. But again, understanding that we have a limited amount of time on this earth and how we spend that time. There's nothing we can do to earn more time. We can always earn more money. We can always, put in more hours at the office, but we're never going to be able to get back that time. So when we think about what we're spending our money on and how we're spending our money, it's not just a question of how much, but it's why is that important? And if it's that important to you, let's figure out a way to make it work rather than saying, we'll talk about that in 5 years. What we're going to save for the next 5 years so you can justify that $8 latte. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, one, it's kind of you to say that I added a little bit of value somewhere, but I think that's so true, right? Like I've been a very big believer in our experiences for a very long time, and I've probably mentioned it on this podcast in some form or fashion. But there's just this incredible paper by Elizabeth Dunn, Dan Gilbert, and Tim Wilson. I'm gonna butcher the title, so I apologize ahead of time. But it's the idea of like if money doesn't make you happy, you're probably not spending it right. And I think there's a lot of lessons in that paper that I've tried to extract, but the number one principle takeaway for me is buy experiences, not things. We know, for example, that experience things kind of add that like warm and fuzzy feeling or that kind of dopamine hit for about 6 to 12 weeks and then they wear off, but kind of experiences can live in perpetuity. I to your point using that term, which I love, is return on experiences, right? Like they can compound back to the financial terms, they can compound in perpetuity almost when you think about it. Revisiting that trip 20 years from now and how you felt and what you got out of it, right? Like that live for a long time. But you mentioned a really great one, right? Because I think that comes into what do you want life to look like? That question that you reframe for people, like, hey, not when do you want to retire, but what do you want retirement to look like? What do you want those experiences to feel like? How do you factor that in? And again, back to that question about kind of reframing it in a more traditional sense with that purpose overlay. How are you doing that within, like, for example, an experiences side of it?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up all the time, right? I mean, when we start talking about cash flow with clients, they'll talk about, vacation is important to them, or they want to buy a beach house or a lake house or whatever it might be. And there's this tendency, and I think our industry has coached people into this. There's this tendency to push that out into the future, right? And this is going to echo a lot of what you and I have already talked about. But one of the things we'll do is say, hey, look, if we could help you move the timeline up on that by 5, 10 years, would that be meaningful for you? Right. And just a simple flip of that, say, would that be meaningful for you? They're like, I didn't even think that was possible. And so our ability to use numbers to help them have the experiences today, not push them off, 5, 10, 15 years, really changes the dynamic and helps them understand, like, look, it's not a question of now or then. It's now and then. And our job is to say, this is what it would look like, right? This is what you said was important to you. And if you were to execute on this vision and follow these steps, we believe there is a path for you to have that lake home that you can spend time with your children, grandchildren, siblings, whoever is important to you. And again, that subtle shift of asking the question, would that be meaningful for you? That is not going to have the same impact if we talk about, if you saved an extra 5 grand, would that be meaningful? Candidly, no, for almost anyone. Like, yeah, dollars matter, but it's not going to move the conversation.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that question, if anyone can take that away, right? I think that is the right question to take away from this conversation is like, can that be meaningful? Because you can apply that to so many things, by the way. And you just justified me getting Oasis tickets, so thank you. Um, as an avid, you know, avid fan. But I think that's right. And I think that is unique because, you know, I spent 15 years at a firm calling on advisors across the spectrum. And the conversation that we're having, I think, is a little more prevalent. You know, I've been out of that for a little while, but I can tell you for 15 years, these weren't the words or the conversations that I heard throughout the industry. I think they're definitely a shift. And I think this idea or this term that you guys have coined or we have coined in purpose-based planning is unique, right? Like in some form or fashion. Um, and I love the idea is that meaningful, like encouraging someone to spend more money, right? Like I think that is different. You know, it seems so simple, but it is so different, right? Giving someone again back to like the coaching world and some of the psychology stuff, right? Like giving someone the permission by using math to say it's okay, right? Like we all love that feeling of someone telling us it's okay, right? Like I think about my kids in sports, for example. Like it's okay, you missed the shot, you took it. Like that's really important. I know you live and breathe the soccer world. Probably say the same things. Um, you know, back to again, you don't have to cite specific examples, but I just love to kind of hear like what the emotional response has been with clients when you tell someone something like that. Like, listen, we can pull this forward. You know, you can now do X, or you can take this trip. Like, what have you read in terms of like that part of the language?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Adam. So what I would say is we're still in the early innings. I have a lot of experience reading people when it comes to some of the traditional financial side, but reading the response to some of the more qualitative stuff is something I'm still getting my arms around. I would say the response has been overwhelmingly positive, if for no other reason that we're defining for people, you know, putting it down on paper and saying, hey, this is what you said was important to you. So when they come back in, it's not just a conversation of, hey, the S&P did this, your portfolio did this, we're great or we're underperforming. Relative to what? Because the S&P certainly has nothing to do with your ability to buy a lake house and spend time with your grandkids. Uh, it may support it, but it's not the driving factor. What we want to do is say, are we still on path to do that? You know, and are we able to achieve that goal while taking the appropriate amount of risk in order to get there? So my sense is that it's been well received. I think we're continuing to refine how we are bringing these types of conversations both early in client relationships, but also on an ongoing basis. And I'm excited to see what we're able to do, you know, as we continue to progress in this direction.
Yeah, I think that's it's so true because I mean, and now we're talking about emotion, right? Talk about things that are hard to put metrics around or define. Um, you know, but back to kind of the early innings, which I think the industry is as a whole on this. You know, what challenges do you see ahead within this space?
Look, you know, something you hear around our office regularly is incentives drive outcomes, right? And so what people are struggling with in the industry is how do they monetize this? And I think where we're really open is, you know, we understand this is a significant value add. And if we do this well, there's going to be no shortage of opportunities and folks that are going to be able to benefit from what we do. So it's less of how do we monetize on a transactional basis or how do we keep more money in the portfolio, thereby not spending it on the lake house today or not spending it on the personal trainer today to get it in better shape. That's not what's driving our recommendations. Our recommendations are what is best for the client based on what they said is important to them. How do we take into consideration all of the different resources that we can bring to bear, whether that's accountants, attorneys, medical professionals, you name it. We want to be able to bring resources to bear to help clients live their best life. And because we are focused on delivering a world-class client experience, we are able to take a long-term view of what's going to allow our firm to be successful and allow the people that work at Journey to really enjoy and feel rewarded in the work that they're doing. So similar to what we're trying to do for our clients, we understand that some things aren't quantitative, right? And the value and that we derive from the work we do is significantly important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, right? It's this, it's this gray area right now of kind of what does all this mean, um, in some form or fashion. And to your point, right, an industry that is really driven to help people save more, right, or have higher returns, encouraging kind of both the clients and the space itself to start to rethink some of that, right, and bring in a very different perspective of, listen, uh, if you want, back to that example of the lake house, or you want to retire earlier, or you want to completely pivot and say, like, like careers, for example, and take a cut of some form or fashion to pursue something that you love, you find interest in, like that is unique. And the one other component that I think, and I harken back to something you said earlier about kind of what's a little bit of a headwind or a challenge is I think also is just getting people to understand and open up on a lot of those questions of what they really want. I think a lot of people just, yeah, maybe I'm wrong, but I think a lot of people haven't asked those questions of themselves, to be honest with you, of like, what do I really want, right? Like, what do I want my retirement to look like? What do I want, to do? What do I want to pursue? Um, right. Because I wrote something a little bit about retirement, and there's a study done from a time perspective, and some of the stats were shocking about what people are doing in retirement, right? I think they're on average sleeping over 9 hours, if I have that correctly, which is, no indicator of anything specifically other than like that's much larger than I had expected. Physical activity, travel, and experience, like those numbers weren't as high because based upon what you hear, right? And like this better than anybody. You ask somebody what you want to do in retirement. I think if we were playing the Family Feud, it would be like travel, golf, grandkids, vacation, you know, relax or whatever it is. But those numbers weren't as high. So I think it's just also, I think from my side of the table and working with the clients at the firm and just in general, it's, a lot of people, when you ask that question, what do you really want? It's a harder question to ask too, I think a little bit.
Yeah. You know, one of our core values at Journey is, a philosophy of abundance. And I think that is, a lot of people can talk a big game about that. But when I think about what that means in the context of purpose-based planning is how do you seek out the life you want to live today without sacrificing your future, right? And there's this scarcity mindset of if I do this today, I won't be able to do it in the future. And we just fundamentally disagree, right? I think if you do these things today, what you want for your future is going to look completely different, and it should, right? And so we want to equip you with the tools and the resources to be able to attack life on your terms by understanding what's important to you, putting the resources around you to help you achieve that, and knowing that if we do those things, opportunities are going to present themselves for you and for us to continue to thrive in the industry. And it's really exciting, right? There's a first mover advantage. We want to be toward the front of the pack on this. You're helping us lead the charge on that. And I know I certainly have learned a lot from our conversations, but it's exciting, right? I think we're at the precipice of really being able to take some big strides as far as what the future looks like for the offerings here at Journey. And, we're going to continue to march forward full steam ahead. It's going to be an exciting next few years.
Yeah, and I think, but you just set up a really good close as we kind of probably end the conversation. And I think what you just shared and the way you shared it is the idea or definition of that purpose-based planning within the financial space, right? Like the idea that using kind of the traditional wealth management approach of kind of numbers, cash flow, balance sheets, but then integrating and layering over that wellness or that purpose component, and then kind of integrating those two together, right? And saying, look, like we're asking those questions you may not have asked, and now we're applying numbers around it and telling you it's okay. And those two things together, I think, and this is a term I use a lot and love, and we could talk about the, ceiling man and positive psychology, but it's flourishing, right? Like those two things give people the capacity and capability to flourish in their life, right? In health, in wealth, and all the other words you want to use. And I think that's it. I think what again, I would put that on repeat and say like that is the true definition. So I appreciate it. So as we close out today, just thanks again for joining us. It's been a little while, so we apologize. I think there's some things coming. We've been working from a marketing side to kind of clean things up and make the delivery better and resources better, which is kind of what we've been working on a little bit this summer. Looking forward to kind of rolling that all out here towards the end of the year. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, I think last time, one of the big things is kind of like what's happening, from a SOGI or big challenge perspective, anything kind of floating around in your world?
Yeah. So, as a parent, that's always a bit of a moving target. But, as Whitney and I have made shifts to our career over the last several years, right, we're now getting to a place where I feel like we can go from strategic to tactical, right? Strategically, we're where we want to be. So how do we start to take some of our own medicine and say, okay, this is what the future looks like for us. These are the things that are important, right? So making it a priority to plan the vacations, plan, events that our kids will look back and remember fondly, and not getting so caught up in how busy we are, because there's no shortage of work to do. But for that work to be meaningful, we need to make sure we're investing in each other, investing in the family, and creating memories that are going to be, have a significant ROE or return on experience.
I love it. I mean, that's it. You kind of framed it up in a nutshell, and I like the idea that, like what you're talking about is walk the walk, right? Like all those things you're bringing to the table in those client meetings, like you're integrating them into your own life, which is fantastic. So thanks again, Michael. It's great to see you. Looking forward for more of these in the future. Like I said, there's more to come. We'll have that in the near term. But other than that, looking forward to doing this again soon.
Thanks very much, Adam. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too.